We are now moving into a very tricky path, redefining planning by leveraging technology. I think we have had multiple views of technology throughout the day. And I have with me a set of eminent planners and supply chain of professionals who will help us discuss some of the issues that pertain to technology. I'm not going to restrict it to AI/ML. Starting with Keyur Pandya, General Manager Supply Chain, Thermo Fisher Scientific. Keyur, if we could have you, please. Dr. Ravi Prakash Mathur, Vice President Supply Chain Management, Dr. Reddy's Laboratories. Vijay Subramanian, Vice President Professional Services, Kinexis. Gaurav Bhatia, General Manager Supply Chain, Reliance Retail. Amir Hussain, Senior Vice President Integrated Supply Chain Leader, Jubilant Foodworks. And Sunit Mukherjee, Head Lubricant Supply Chain, India Hub Shell India Markets Private Limited. And I will be the agent provocator for this panel. Let me see if I can provocate our panelists into a more animated discussion. Since morning, we have been on a technology trip. To forecast and not to forecast was also technology. Sometimes it leads us to wonder whether the panel on technology is relevant. However, what we would in this panel try to look at is to move beyond the obvious larger statements of how technology is good, why technology is good, and probably look at some of those areas where technology can be actually used to make a difference to the way we plan, to make a difference to the supply chains, and at the end of it, whether we like it or not, we live in an investor-driven world. Everything is the bottom line. So, probably, Keyur, if I could start with you. You come from an industry which is one of the trickiest things when it comes to planning. And if I more specifically say, planning for new equipment sales is passive, but I think planning for the other side of it, which is your MRO. What are your experiences with technology on that end?
Sure. Thanks, Girish. I think a very relevant question from the point of view that COVID times, when you look at healthcare as an industry, that was the most focused industry where each one of us were looking out for new equipment and making sure that the equipments are up and running. So I think that's where this technology actually came into picture, and most of the healthcare industries were relying on technology and making sure that how they are able to keep their uptime of the equipment. That's when they came up with digital technologies of having to understand and sense which part of the equipment is expected to break down. I think digital twin was one area that was used by a lot of people. Mean time between failures was another statistical tool that was used by a lot of people in terms of understanding the history of the equipment, history of the spare parts that are getting worn and torn out, and that's how getting those spare parts in advance, such that the uptime of the equipment is continued. Because what we saw in the earlier sessions is whether to forecast or not to forecast, right? So there are SKUs which cannot be forecasted, but at the same time, how do I keep the equipment running? If that particular part is essential part of the equipment, I still need to make it available. While from the supply chain standpoint, I can always say that, that part is not forecasted and it has its own lead time. But that does not work in the real life. So that's the other piece. The third aspect was extending the supply chain. So through technology and through digitalization, how do I get my vendors, the parent company and the customers integrated? Because that is the crux of the entire thing, where you have seamless data integration and communication flow. Because the faster you get to know, the faster you are able to react. Right? We can do scenario planning, we can do all of that. but it's all about how fast do we sense. In the earlier panel also we also heard that we could start sensing the semiconductor shortages, but how many of us reacted to it? Very few. That's where that integration of an extended supply chain makes a difference.
Thank you, Kev. In fact, one of the distinction things, apart from what you talked about, is that you kept it very crisp, and that added a lot of punch to what you did say. We live in a world of Twitter, and a tweet is more relevant today, and I think the responses on tweet tags are also good. Dr. Mathur, when I come to you, you are just in the journey of implementing an end-to-end supply chain technology intervention. What I would like you to probably take us through is a philosophy behind the technology that you wanted to bring in, because today buying technology is one thing, but then what is the vision and what is the kind of thinking process that managements need to have when they look at something like an enterprise transformation technology? If you could probably look at that piece.
Thanks, Girish, for that question. I think it's very important. So, for those who are not aware, what we have been doing recently, Dr. Reddy, is that we have undertaken a journey which is called integrated business planning. So, in integrated business planning, we have integrated not only the supply chain end to end, but we have also integrated its impact with other parts of the organization. I think Kirill mentioned about the extended supply chain, and in the earlier panels also, we have talked about how early you can get the demand signals so that your time to impact is, less than your time to react. Okay, so when you have an incoming missile, so the time to impact should be less than your time to kind of prepare for it. Okay, so that's as far as your external supply chain is concerned. What most of the time we are blind to is, as supply chain professionals, that okay, we are making the supply chain team more responsive, the supply chain organization more responsive. What we don't understand is what it means to the internal organization. Okay, now you have reacted, you have lined up new material, you have lined up new production plans, you have lined up new fulfillment strategies, and your customer is getting, so you're competing on availability, you're competing on, being there in the market. But what has all this agility that you have designed for? What does it mean for your own organization? There's no thought for that. Imagine a CFO who's having to deal with multiple scenarios. As a supply chain person, I'm very happy. I have 5 scenarios, I can execute all 5 of them. But does that mean I have 5 P&L statements? Not possible, no? So this information that has to cascade internally in a way that you do not lose out on the predictability that you need at an organizational level. You can't go to the street and say, this quarter I got 5 scenarios. Can you do that? You cannot do that, right? So integrating of what supply chain means to the rest of the organization in terms of, can you generate for every scenario that you are trying to envision? Do you have a consensus on what the P&L will be for this quarter? Do you know what the consensus is for the P&L for the different business units? What do you mean? Do you have a P&L for the entire year? Similarly, how does your plan integrate with your long-term revenue projection? Are your quarterly plans in sync with your annual plans? Are your annual plans in sync with your long-term 5-year out revenue plans? So, outside integration, yes, there's a challenge, but there is an equal challenge that it exists internally. What does that information mean for the enterprise itself? That is what we have been trying to think about, that we've got to sort about.
That's very interesting, because when you look at software implementations, most often failures are equally common as successful implementations, and probably where they fail is the vision and the thought process behind it and the kind of anticipation of what kind of issues that are there. Vijay, I would like to come back to you once I poke all of them with the challenges, and then I would look for, because Vijay is more of a solution person and they are the problem guys. So I think we get the problem in before we hit the solution guy. So if I could hold on to you, that could you could wrap it up there. Gaurav, you are in a place where in a sector where we thought pharmacies and medical shops are the way to go. It's now becoming more of e-pharmacies and the direct-to-consumer kind of world that you're living in. how do you see, how do you leverage technology in these areas, and what are the wish lists that you have for technology when you go into these kind of applications?
So I think before I answer, just taking a step back and reflecting upon so the topic, which is very, very interesting in terms of leveraging technology. So I can leverage any technology, but just before that, we need to take a step back, reflect, where am I? And I think a good framework, or what I see at is Gartner's classification, where it tells where you are today and where you want to be. So it is like there's a 5-step maturity curve for your supply chain, from reactive, proactive, adaptive, integrated, and finally to a symphony supply chain, where hardly 1 or 2 organizations are there today. So if I need to know where I want to be and where am I, and then it makes more sense, because journey for each organization is very, very different. For Reliance, or for any pharma organization, or for any e-commerce organization, it will be very, very different. For if I talk about us, we are more into, as a strategy, we are more into red ocean strategy. So kind of disrupt the market, take the market share very, very quickly. So that's the journey. And to answer your question in specific, I think the wish is to keep customer at the center. How do we ensure the customer is king, and he can order, whether be it through B2C, through an online app, and get it home delivered, get it delivered at a nearby smartphone, and he can pick at his convenient time. The third could be totally a kind of ensuring that wherever he is, he gets it delivered to his parents' home, or kind of the business where we are in pharma e-commerce. It's mainly chronic for now, which is taking the larger pie of our, I would say, sales, which is into blood sugar, medicines, hypertensions, etc. So we want to give that choice to the customer with omni-channel. So how do we plan our entire planning, entire distribution, DRP, and entire logistics, especially last mile for pharma e-commerce, holds a lot of relevance, and the entire planning revolves around that, where the customer is given multiple choices, as I said. So could be direct delivery, could be picking up as per his convenience from a smartphone store. Again, we have a huge network, pan-India smart stores, etc., where he can get it delivered, pick while coming home. So I think giving choices and enabled by the technologies, leveraging them to ensure that he gets those multiple choices.
Thanks, Gaurav. If I were to come to you, Amir, one of the problems that we also see is that since morning we have heard a number of technologies being used. We have heard about digital twins, scenario planning. We've talked about edge computing, which is coming up. As a planner and as a supply chain professional, what are the kind of technology trends that we need to track, and what are the kind of implications that we need to be aware about of these technologies? How do you manage yourself in all of this? Because most organizations do have a CIO or a CTO who looks at technology, but I believe that finally the bill is on you, and therefore understanding technology by you is as critical as for the CIO. So how do you look at that space?
Thank you. So I think before I get into answering what you asked for, let me just take a step back and connect a few dots. Okay, I think when Keru talked about importance of inventory visibility, in this case visibility between the vendor and the user. I think Ravi talked about importance of scenario planning and while doing your SNOP, executive SNOP, etc., looking at various scenarios so that whatever we are trying to change, whether it is revenue or profitability or share, etc., with the current constraints and current situation, what is the best what we can do, and continuously keep on looking at it. And then I think Gaurav talked about supply chain which is orchestrated supply chain, which is the highest level of maturity. That so these are some of the themes, and I agree to these themes, and I think what I want to talk about, I want to just connect some of these things. Plus, I just want to also talk about JFL, Jubilant Foodworks, which has about 70% market share in with the Domino's, and we have multiple brands, whether it is Popeyes or Dunkin' Donuts, or our own brands, or Chef Boss, which is a FMCG brand, our own restaurants called Ekdam Biryani and Hongs, wherein through our central kitchens we actually supply that. Okay, so being multi-brand, multi-geography organization, and we pride ourselves by calling ourselves as Amazon of QSR industry, because everything, the most important part for us as strategies, how are we using the digital solutions. So trying to connect to whatever speakers have talked and connect to what we are doing. I think the response, as you rightly said, any technology we invest, I think it's very important to look at how it's going to give us returns. It's very important, while also keep on trying out, and maybe in this whole process there could be failures, and it's perfectly fine to fail, learn and move on. That's first point. Second, and I would like to give some of the examples. So I think in one of the previous sessions with ISCM I talked about the need for breaking the chain, a linear chain, and having overall digital supply networks, or digital, I would say demand networks, demand fulfillment networks, responsive demand fulfillment networks, which is all about looking at what is the demand in the market and how responsively we are able to service that. Now, when we look at that, and connecting to what Gaurav talked about in terms of orchestration, you need to be able to integrate all of the stakeholders, whether it's the suppliers, whether it's your customer, whether it's your internal supply chain, or our own different functions, finance, etc. And hence it's required to have technology, whatever best technology available, keep on trying out so that we are able to get everyone on the same page. And that's where one example wherein we are able to do that is using AI and ML to do forecasting. We have about 40 odd algorithms which are continuously looking at everyday data, because all our sales are on the app, all our sales are in POS, and through that continuously looking at it and continuously looking at forecast, so that we are able to give those forecasting plans to suppliers, and at the same time continuously service our stores by generating orders which were being done manually through AI/ML. So that's one way we have been able to use technology. Again, that's on the demand side. On the supply side, resource planning, what kind of resources are required to be able to service the continuously evolving demand variation which is there, so that you are able to take care of service while taking care of efficiency, and also have different solutions in terms of, if we are not able to serve from one location, how can we source from some other locations. For that, whether through TMS, having the maps of the stores to the drivers who may be coming from a different location. Okay, so I think so it's all about trying, and in this whole process, about 30 to 40% of our projects would have failed. So whether it's resource planning, whether it is access control, whether it is, and some of my team members are actually right there sitting, and always we keep on looking at how to try out. It's okay to fail, but keep on trying and keep on leveraging the digital transformation to see that we are able to meet the needs of the consumer and take care of our share and profitability.
That's a very interesting. Point. You said that you need to fail. That you should not measure yourself against failures, but I think you should be suspicious about people who have not failed. That's the right way to look at the technology implementation, at least at a world when technology is evolving so fast. Sunit, if I were to bring you in at this point in time, we know most of the things. We have been talking about these things that we need agility, we need visibility, we need technology. But we look at the actual implementation of technology or adoption of technology in supply chain, even among all corporate functions, I think it's at a historical low. What holds us back from putting money on technology?
Tough questions. So I'll come to that answer a bit late. So I'm just trying to lay some context here. I think, in the morning as well, when you talked about demand planning forecasting, we try to touch upon moral, what is the requirement from the business and how technology and the culture of the organization has really taken it forward. So I think first and foremost, according to me, I've seen this evolution of demand planning over the last 20 years when you had I2, then you had SAP, APO, then you are having AI, ML, so on and so forth. But I think for me, the most important part in this journey, I have been with FMCG and now I am into oil and gas. So if I have to just look into how the things are moving, I think demand planning as a profession is the most important supply chain role in an organization. So that's the way I look into that. And it's something which is like function agnostic. I would rather see demand planner reporting directly to CEO so that he's totally unbiased and he is no way getting influenced by sales, marketing, supply chain or whoever, right? He has to speak his mind and the only friend that he's having the trend. Trend is his best friend, right? And there exactly all your tools, technology, process and everything comes together and makes the things much more successful.
What I have seen is that sometimes we fail because ultimately all your buyers and others, even though you have technology, but you get swayed away so much and you get influenced so much that the numbers what you're supposed to project, you don't even forget that, right? So that is a kind of an evolution which has happened in the last 10 years as well. When I find that the finest people in a lot of organizations, I find like the finest supply chain brains who are brave. I'm also talking about the soft ones who are brave, courageous, and who can speak their mind and definitely give the right forecast. Now, forecast, right? So we also discussed today that this black swan events, how near you can be towards the forecast. But the question is that is a bit different actually, because that's a part of the risk management, how agile you are and how your network and your strategies all there in an organization to take care of the risk, right? No one is expecting us to forecast something or a war is happening, XYZ is happening. That's the job of the intelligence and how you put those intelligence as in building blocks into your plan, right? So that is exactly where I was trying to talk to myself when the discussion was happening. Is a planner really required? Like after 24 months, what are the events which is going to happen between Russia, XYZ? No, he's not supposed to do that. Rather, as an organization, it has to be well prepared in terms of your business continuity plan, plus one supplier, how you can have more and more localization, how you can have a supply security. Those are the areas which people have started thinking for the last 3-4 years. And for all our discussion purpose, I think this disruption is nothing new that after this COVID it has started, right? It has started way back in 2012 onwards. Now we had demonetization, we had GST, and we all have understood might be those companies wherein it is all global linked, wherein the sourcing has become a big question currently in terms of China and the way your sourcing strategy is there. I think there exactly the problem arose much more rather than those companies who had 90% of the things localized, because they have taken care of that during your demonetization and GST when the demand was totally out of control. Coming to a question in terms of the adoption of the technology, what really becomes a barrier? I think sometimes, when the things are going pretty well, when your gross margins are well protected, right, then definitely service, cost, cash becomes the three elements and the foundation layers for taking any kind of a decision out here. But the moment when the things are not going well, that is the place where the challenge comes, that how much to use in the technology. But the good part is that I think technology, be it like whenever companies at this AI, ML or whatever we do currently, so there's nothing new actually, everything was existing. Artificial intelligence, I remember, I had done in 1995 as an industrial engineer, right? Now it was much ahead actually, ahead of time. Now it has, is much more into the rhythm out here. The question is that whether you are with the time or not. And again, the leadership comes into the play in terms of really convincing an organization that how much to invest, when to invest, whether it really falls into the strategic imperatives of the company or not. I think if that can be taken care of, so definitely, I think you can convince the organization to invest into that. And in the current context, the last 4 or 5 years of disruptions, I think organizations have also understood that kind of time which is required for any kind of a manual or maybe the archaic processes that we are having. Technology is the main thing, and that's the question of how we convince and move ahead.
It's quite further. In fact, I like the distinction you made between what the forecaster should focus on and what he should not. Are you supposed to forecast a war? I don't think we are the right people to do that. But yes, there should be someone looking at that whole process and saying that if this happens, what will happen to my balance sheet?
That's scenario planning.
Yes.
And as a demand planning role, basically you have your building blocks very widely and very succinctly laid upon. Your competitive pricing, your promotions, then your baseline forecast, and basis that, the events. And then actually the role comes wherein you have to have a solid influencing power on the organization to really cut across or transcend the barriers and challenge sales marketing and go for that number. And your conviction is a function of not only your brand. Your conviction is a function of your data and how you influence and in a territory, because a demand planner typically doesn't belong to sales, right? So imagine a supply chain professional becoming a demand planning head. His intelligence has to be the highest level of convincing marketing, sales, finance, everyone, and to the CEO as well. So that's the way it is.
And I also like your statement of friend is your friend, but I think an inflection is your enemy. So we are both friends and enemies. Frenemies there when it comes to data and friends.
Just to add what Sunil was saying, I agree to all of that, what he was saying, but just to add there is also an element of time. So the digitalization or the technology is helping us save that time and take that decision on a very timely basis. That's the
And what I think Dr. Mathur mentioned as time to impact and time to react.
No, I think on the point of intelligence, I completely agree, that getting intelligence is not the job of the planner. But I think we are also more focused on demand side intelligence, competitor intelligence, market intelligence. What we are blind to is basically supply intelligence. Right? Hardly any of us have system that enables you to create a supply forecast. You can create an execution response from your planning instance, but you do not have a supply forecast. Okay? And what's the reason you don't have a supply forecast? There is no data. Right? The furthest you can go down is your own purchase orders. Right? Beyond that, you don't have data. Okay, so what we have been trying to do is also invest in getting those external data and stitch that data, curate it, automate, and put it into a system that gives you that time to response. And supposing you have a supply network map, and then you can play around what happens if this region is impacted, what happens if this customer is impacted, and then if you can calculate time to impact, then gives you a better response even for supply side. So we have to remove that, that blind spot which is the supply uncertainty, and get some more data on that also.
Yes. I would now like to pick up, I'm going to bring all these things together into a mega question for you, Vijay, because you're at the receiving end of it. We started off with Dr. Rakesh Singh, who said that, automate everywhere, put sensors everywhere, create networks everywhere, and analyze. Right? Simple part of looking at technology. We also have Gartner, who keeps periodically publishing their hype cycles, and most of the technologies which people talk about, AI, and are all at the top of the hype cycle. We have people here who are responsible for taking a decision on that technology. Now, here is a problem which I would like you to probably help us understand. There is so much of confusion around all this. Do I go in for a digital twin? Do I focus on AI, ML? How do I decide what is the technology? What technology should I adopt? And what happens if I come up with a Vitamax moment?
First of all, Girish, you introduced me, or you told me I'm a solution guy. I just want to add a little bit more to that. Last 20 years, yes, I'm a solution guy. But first 10, 12 years of my career, I was on the other side. I started my career in supply chain planning in the business world. I had done all these planning functions. In fact, that's where I learned a lot. And I still consider myself as a business guy than the solution guy, because supply chain solutions, we are solving business problems. So technology in the supply chain world should be treated differently than technology the world. Because supply chain planning is very complex. And just to give you a context, I live in Silicon Valley. I'm in the technology headquarters, but I look at things more from the business side. Simplicity is important. Now, if you look at the supply chain, 25 years ago, I worked for a mid-sized company in the US. It's about 500 people, and it was manufacturing. I was a production planning manager. And I was quite young. I was in my late 20s. And all these planners were very experienced people. And it was really a good company. The main problem was we had all these functions there. They call sales, demand planning, production planning, capacity planning, procurement. They were all acting in silos. And then the trust level was very low. I was a production planning guy. Sales or demand planning, if they want an order done in 4 weeks, the customer says, I want 4 weeks, they will tell us 3 weeks. Because they are thinking as, if I tell these guys 3 weeks, I will get it at least in 4 or 5 weeks. And on the production side, our guys, if we can produce in 3 weeks, we'll tell them 5 weeks. Because if something happened here, we say we commit to 3 weeks, and something happens, it takes 4 weeks, fall escalation. So the trust level was low. Now, fast forward 25 years, we still have the same problem. In the business world, we are still working as silos, and still the trust is low. So for me, technology, any technology, if it needs to make an impact, it needs to address two things. The solutions, it should enable problem solving, not in a siloed manner, in a collaborative, integrated manner. Second, it should provide enough visibility so that the trust level increases. So that is the role of technology. Unfortunately, technology goes with more of a hype mindset, all these other fancy words. But I think it should address the basic complexity in supply chain. That is, it is integrated. All these keywords I wrote, integrated, and this morning we talked about agility, resilience. These are all the fundamentals. So if a technology addresses that, whatever technology, that can help. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, technology is actually, instead of being a leader, it's a follower. Because businesses run in silos, technology also silos. Oh, we have modules to optimize demand planning. So demand planning happens in isolation. Well, it's all integrated. This morning we talked about demand planning should also take into consideration the supply constraints. What is realistic? So if the technology or the philosophy of technology addresses this, it can make a big difference.
Yeah, but then how do I choose what to put my money on?
So that's why you should investigate the technology. Is it solving problems in a siloed manner? Doesn't matter AI or is it solving problems? Is it helping the integration or it's focusing one at a time? If it does helps, it does help with integration and collaboration, then you should put money on that. You don't want to replicate the siloed mindset. If the technology is replicating that, in my opinion, then you may not get it.
At this point, I would also like to check if anyone from the audience, the expertise is also on that side. We recognize that very clearly, and we would invite you also to raise your questions. Yes, sir.
Hi Vijay, this is Devojyoti from Unilever. Actually, we have been working with Kinexis, you can say, pretty actively in many of the markets. My question is that when your last concluding statement that we should investigate, you consider technology as it is fit. In your experience, when you have been working different markets across, you can say, not only FMCG but other industries, what is that approach that you really find that companies have used and which has been able to, you can say, establish the amount of value that you can say Kinexis, and I'm calling out the concurrent planning aspect or the scenario planning that is one of the USPs of Kinexis. So how do you really, and a lot of people, the concept would be very new, right?
Yeah.
And hence, what approach do you find, you can say, is much more suitable to understand what's the value that the technology is going to give? And I'm coming from the perspective there is, it's easier to quantify the value when the problem is well quantified. Let's say if you want to improve the forecastability or so on and so forth. But if you really want to, if your problem statement is that you want to make your supply chain more resilient, and how can Kinexis help us to make the supply chain and the planning more resilient, these questions are a little bit more difficult to answer. So what's your experiences that you can share?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very important question. You know, can I talk about Kinexis? Okay, I'm not a sales guy. We have some sales people, but I was a customer myself. That's why I got introduced to Kinexis 21 years ago. I worked for Philips. We were looking for supply chain planning software. I was leading the software selection. And so when we bought Kinexis 20 years ago, and it still had some similar functionality, it was so unique, so different than other software. So in order to use that, knowledge is so important. So we really focused on training, educating the planner community about what is uniqueness about Kinexis. How is it different? So without that mindset, it'll be difficult. So that is very important. The knowledge, the people understanding the functionality, what Kinexis can do, then it will help the team to use it properly, because it's a teamwork. And so I would say the knowledge, and then once they have the knowledge, then it should be a collaborative effort. What is the business objective? What are the problems they want to solve? Then they work with the consultants, and so together they can address. A lot of the time, what I see is too much importance is given to speed, and we should take a step back and look at the big picture. What are the pain points? What are the important areas we should address? So if you do that homework, then you can lay a strong foundation for future growth. I keep going back to supply chain is complex. If someone says in 6 months, 9 months, I will solve all your problems, I won't believe. So it is a journey, and laying the foundation and preparing for future success is important. And then there will be a lot of benefits after that. So knowledge, expertise, and then also taking a step back and looking at holistically rather than point to solution. Because that's what the software is about.
Yeah, those are very pertinent points. But I'd just like to add, try to help you on your question about how do you quantify that. That's what you were asking, because in other things, then you can calculate your ROI, but something like a concurrent planning or scenario modeling, how do you measure that? How do you measure that success of it? So I think all of these mechanisms, whether it's scenario modeling, what if analysis, simulation, or whatever name you want to call it, unless you are able to use it to also simultaneously do predictive KPIs. Okay, supposing I created multiple scenarios, I have three scenarios, but that is not enough unless I know what is the associated OTIF for that scenario, what is the associated throughput for that scenario, what is the associated inventory level for that scenario. Only then it makes sense to me. So, with all these enablements, you also have to define what is your measurement of success. What does success look like for you? If you don't have a clear understanding of that, all these things that you're trying to implement don't really make any sense. Hope I've been able to answer your question.
Shall I give one example? I can just quote, this is the conundrum is basically like how do you choose a technology, right? So in one of the exercises in my previous organization which we had done is that when we were supposed to see what is the right tool and technology for various markets. So the thoughts in the forum was like, spanning across, okay, fine, let's have AP all across, right? But the methodology was not correct at all. So the methodology is basically each and every market behaves very differently in terms of how dynamic that market is. For example, whether it's a consumption-based economy, okay, in that the model will be totally different. Maybe if you cannot even do that job, maybe a demand side can do the job, right? Then what kind of a statistic forecast for your all seasonal products, XYZ, whatever you have, right, classification wise, which particular model can be applied, and in those particular models, which particular software is there. So there is no one single answer that let's go for APU for this market. Every market behaves differently. Suppose a task is given to me in 10 business units, I have to implement one software. I can guarantee you that if you just go blindly for be it APU or XYZ software, it may not be the right success criteria for that. You have to go by these metrics to really understand that what is that particular that particular product that you're selling in that particular market, how does it behave, whether it's a consumption oriented or different methodology can be adapted into that, and basis that you have to choose the technology. Because this is one thing which I have experienced and it has really given, because blindly people go for, okay, let's go for demand. I'm just giving an example here. So we have to look into that market, the structure, the capability, and basis that we should arrive at the tools and the technology.
Yeah, I just want to add some more points, to Girish, to your question. How do you invest technology how do you decide whether you want to invest this in technology? Is this the right technology for me or not? I think the question is a little deeper. It is not about which technology you have to implement it. Whatever technology you are investigating, I think first of all you have to investigate that from first principles. From a point of view of first principles, what are the design principles behind it? What is the basic process we are talking about over here? Technology is just the end manifestation of somebody's thought process. He has created an automated version of it. He has done something else, but the basic thought process is the same. I'll give you a very small example. Somebody asked me, this, have you guys not implemented 3D printing? That's a very fantastic technology. Why is why are people not talking about 3D printing? So before we answer that question, let us understand what 3D printing as a concept does in the first place. 3D printing is doing nothing which in supply chain parlance is called delayed differentiation. Whatever decision point that was there upstream in your supply chain, you have put it down further. But first principle basis, do you need delayed differentiation in your supply chain? If you say yes, and if is additive manufacturing the solution for it, then you go for 3D printing. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to you. So whatever technology you're talking about, understand what is the fundamental model beneath it. Only then you come to technology. If the model is not fitting your process, technology can't do anything for you.
I think I'm getting very strong looks that it's time for me to shut up. And I will shut up with a few words, probably summing up what we did go through as a collective set of people. Technology is a good answer, but it is not the answer. Organizations also need to look at the appropriateness of technology, not only for what they're doing, but also for their culture. Will this technology fit into my organization? Yeah, so this happens to technology, so we need to be aware of what we also need to focus on is not just the appropriateness of the technology. I think organizations need to run on a dual strategy. There is a business as usual which you need to, and you can't bet your major business on an experimental technology. You bring in create a sandbox, a technology sandbox for you to experiment with it, and then use the business as usual to fund the sandbox, so that when that matures, you again come back towards your bring it mainstream. I think with that. Thank you. Now it's back. Okay. So it was a temporary blip in technology, as usual. Technology people say it's only a temporary blip. Right. So I thank all my panelists for having spared their time, and I also thank Jaisal for not being too insistent and cutting me out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Girish, and all the panelists.